Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on when you are viewing this and where you're viewing this webinar from. And welcome to each of you to Collegeville Connections, an online series presented by the Collegeville Institute located on the campus of St. John's University in Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Collegeville Institute programs. It provides an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends to stay connected to each other and to the Collegeville Institute. And most importantly, though, you'll learn a lot about and from our remarkable guests. I'm Carla Durand. I'm on staff at the Collegeville Institute, and I have the privilege and the pleasure of introducing today's guest speakers. But before I get to that, I'll say just a few words about the tech side of things, and we'll share with you what we need to know about logistics. We are streaming this presentation on two platforms, both Facebook Live and Zoom. We hope to have some time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So if you are on Zoom, please add those questions into the chat function. And if you're on Facebook Live, please add your comments into the feed. We have staff members receiving those questions and they'll direct them into the right hands. If you happen to lose your connection over Zoom, you can switch over to Facebook Live and continue streaming from there. And so with that, on to our presentation and our presenters. Our topic for today is spiritual leadership in times of chaos and crisis. The conversation continues. And to help us unpack this topic through conversation is our moderator, Dr. Marty Stortz, and our presenters, Rabbi Aaron Weininger and Reverend Abby Henderson. Dr. Marty Stortz is Professor Emerita of Religion at Augsburg University and Director of the Collegeville Institute's Multi-Religious Fellows Program. She first met Rabbi Aaron Weininger in 2017 during the first cohort of the Collegeville Institute's Multi-Religious Fellows Program, a group she co-led with Rabbi Barry Citron. And through Aaron, she was introduced to Abby Henderson. Marty studied at Carleton College, where she received her Bachelor of Arts, and at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where she completed her master's and doctoral programs. Rabbi Aaron Weininger serves as a rabbi of the Adath Congregation, where he has held the Berman Family Chair in Jewish Learning for 8 years. He earned his BA in Anthropology and Jewish Near Eastern Studies at Washington University in St. Louis and received ordination and an MA in Hebrew Letters from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2012. Aaron served as a fellow in the Collegeville Institute's Multi-Religious Fellows Program from 2017 to 2019 and now sits on the advisory board for that same program. He is entering his third year as co-chair of the Minnesota Rabbinical Association. And lastly, Reverend Abby Henderson is Director of Leadership Development for Minnesota Conference United Church of Christ. In her role, she is co-director of the Damascus Project, an initiative of the Minnesota and Wisconsin conferences that provides clergy, lay people, and members in discernment with meaningful opportunities for faith and leadership growth. Abby earned her bachelor's degree from Wellesley College, her master's degree in social work from the University of Minnesota, and her master's degree of divinity from Harvard Divinity School. She was a participant in the Lilly Endowment's Transition into Ministry program and the UCC Pension Board's Next Generation Leadership Initiative, both of which provide leadership development for young clergy and experiences that have inspired her in her current position. And so with those introductions, I will turn it over to our moderator, Marty Stortz.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Carla. And I guess I'll ask Aaron and Abby how the two of you met and how your friendship began. So Abby, why don't you go first and tell us?
Thanks, Marty. So glad to be here and to be having this conversation with my good friend, Aaron. We met when we were both asked to serve on the board of the Minnesota Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And we were trying to figure out what year that was. And what did we conclude, Aaron? What year was that?
I don't know, with COVID, the passage of time, it's hard to determine exactly. Was it 2013 or 2014, I think.
Something like that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think there was just a sense of instant connection and shared values, and both around, around the mission of that organization, but also in general as two clergy coming together and just had a lot to talk about.
Aaron,
Anything you want to add, Aaron?
Yeah, I remember being a time of discernment, I think, for the organization, going through a process of strategic planning. And what I appreciated about meeting my friend Abby, who's become such a dear friend and colleague, is being able to think through with this organization, with MNRCRC, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, to think through questions that were coming up. And even though we come from different religious traditions, to be able to develop some shared language around reproductive choice and really beyond what it means to be religious leaders in this moment.
how did you manage to talk to one another across difference then? Because I'm sure you were with a group of people, not all of you agreed on things. How did you manage to talk across the differences among you? Aaron, how about you? I'll let you take the lead.
Sure. I think being honest, starting with honesty, where we're coming from. Oftentimes in multi-faith settings, there's a desire to just say, we're all the same, right? We're all worshiping the same God, or we pray the same way, essentially. And I think that papers over really important differences that exist. And when we're able to put the differences on the table, and in this case, we're talking about abortion care and reproductive access. And within any community, whether it's advocacy or activism, there are different approaches and different theological approaches when speaking from a religious framework. And rather than minimize those, to be able to say, I agree or I disagree, and here's why, and to not see that as problematic, but to see those disagreements as the ground upon which relationships are built.
I would really agree. I mean, one thing I appreciated about Aaron from the beginning of our work together was both his curiosity about everybody at the table, and an eagerness to learn and ask questions, but also his fearlessness and willingness to name those differences and remind us of them. And you know, that this, I think it, you know, especially sort of it's very easy for, in a context like Minnesota, for interfaith work to get mistaken as ecumenical work. And for sort of this wash of Protestantism, sort of a Protestantism, to just get like that's sort of a default gathering, you know, tone. Like that's a big bowl that we can all fall into. And that's just really false on a number of levels. And I think that Aaron did a beautiful job of just constantly, but very respectfully, calling our attention to that and nuancing our conversation constantly in a way that was very needed.
Thanks,
I'm
Abby.
asking you to reach back in time, but can you think of an example, either Abby or Aaron, an example of when, you know, it was really important to acknowledge a difference?
I can. I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of our, you know, at the time, there was a lot of energy sort of given to this idea that, you know, that people of faith, that there were sort of, that that the religious right had co-opted the language around abortion, and that they had all of which is true, and that the conversation had been dominated, and that that other voices needed to come in and provide other narratives around reproductive care, reproductive justice. And Aaron was constantly reminding us that Judaism had a very different history around the conversation around abortion, and a different theological stance, a different theological framing, and that if we're really going to talk about religious freedom and what that means in this country, we can't just frame it as conservative Christians versus liberal Christians, or Christians versus atheists, that there are a multiplicity of faith voices, many of them ancient, that need to be present and accounted for. And that there's this rich tradition to be drawing from around bodily autonomy and sort of just the meanings around all of this. And that's what comes to my mind. I don't know if you remember anything, Aaron.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Abby. I think sometimes we end up falling into the traps that may be set for us, that there's this way or there's that way. And that's in the work that we were doing specifically around abortion care, knowingly or not, we end up falling into the binaries that have been created by others, often by those who try to demonize that work around reproductive access. So as much as possible to notice that, and in some ways to kind of, expand the conversation, to notice that in the case of abortion care, so much opposition does come from the Christian religious right, and then to expand the possibility and say, we're not willing to fall into that trap of making it a binary issue. And we have people of multiple faith traditions or spiritual traditions at the table. And certainly when I think of the work of the Collegeville Institute, it's about expanding that landscape. And that's why I'm so excited when I was thinking, okay, who do I want to be in conversation with today? As I was thinking about this, and Abby, you came to mind immediately, because I think not just with the work in RCRC, but I think that's so much of what you do and what you stand for. And I think that's what Collegeville is trying to do, to expand these conversations so that we don't end up trapping ourselves in the same binaries that just don't work on so many issues.
Can you think of, that's a really important point. How do you break through the binaries? Can you name an example, maybe in this first group, or maybe in the work you're doing today, where you were able to break through the kind of binary divide between pro-choice, pro-life, or liberal, conservative, or right, progressive? Aaron, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think there are ways to take those terms and learn from them. A certain language that perhaps each side, for lack of a better term, has been aligned with. So, in kind of the conversation around progressive values, the language of inclusivity, or the language of making sure everyone is part of the conversation. And, in the language of a conservative landscape, a sense of responsibility and what it means to build something and belong to something. And I think there's a way to craft out of that a new way forward. And in doing that, it's not a matter of just saying anything goes and that, we can all compromise. I think compromise is often not a very interesting thing to do. I think when we're able to actually bring all of our differences together and say, how do we draw on all of those differences, not to create this mealy-mouthed approach, but a robust approach to all of the challenges we face. Certainly in the Jewish community, I think a lot about issues of race and issues of racism, and how the Jewish community navigates that as a community that often experiences the privileges of whiteness, but has not historically, and that there are many people in the Jewish community who don't identify as white and are people of color and Black Jews. So, kind of the binaries that may have worked, or the binaries we thought that worked for decades and decades, are not serving us well. And so as religious leaders, how do we take some of those, acknowledge them, and then say, we have to find a different way to do this? And again, not to compromise and not to reduce it to just this or that, but to expand the options.
Abby, how about you?
Well, I would say that a binary, a sort of popular binary that I'm navigating now, and I wouldn't claim to be navigating it with success, but it's just one that I'm keenly aware of in my work, and I think this is one that many denominations are working in, is the rural versus urban separation. It's such a reality in Minnesota, where we have this huge urban center of the Twin Cities, and then this big geographical outstate situation that's diverse in its own way too. And in the Minnesota conference, we have churches all over, and they're all, we're all supposed to belong to the same body. But there can be a really divergent sense of values, identity, and I think a very seductive sense that the needs of rural and urban communities are in conflict. And it's quite easy, particularly around some of the issues that Aaron was just naming, when it comes to certain social justice concerns, like racial justice, immigration justice, food justice, all kinds of different things, LGBTQIA justice, mental health, healthcare access. And it's very hard to have a conversation, of course, and to build coalitions when you go in assuming that your needs just simply aren't in alignment, or that you're in competition for resources. And of course, our tradition tells us that that's not true at all, and urges us to come at the whole thing from a different point of view, from a viewpoint of abundance. But of course, that's like in a time of fear, that's extremely hard to pull off. So making that paradigm shift is, it's a practice, I think, and requires discipline and dedication and intention.
It feels so countercultural. It feels both so important and so countercultural at the same time, because so much of the way news is presented, and I think about the information dump from social media and all of the ways in which we process news, is so much about creating or recreating or reinforcing binaries. And Abby, to your example, into the magnificent work that you do and thinking about urban and rural, that it doesn't need to be versus, but the realities may be different. It doesn't need to be pitted against each other. And at the same time, maybe it's our discomfort dealing with difference. And I know that can often be an issue in Minnesota, that if there's difference, it's automatically perceived as versus. And so that divide ends up getting reinforced, whether or not we're conscious of it. And and that creates patterns. And I think a lot, being part of the LGBTQ community, one of the benefits or one of the gifts I like to think about is we're already in the business of challenging binaries. And so we can take, or I can take that work that I already tried to think about in my own identity and bring that to bear in how I think about relationships, not having to fit into the way we've always done it, because the way we've always done it doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah, amen. I mean, I think that's another huge point of connection for Aaron and I, is that we both identify as part of the LGBTQ community and as clergy, and and sort of queering religion is a particular perspective that has been really beautiful to share with each other.
Yeah.
So this is fascinating. I mean, what's one thing that you've learned that you've imported into your own work as a religious leader, that you've learned from that, from breaking the binaries of in sexuality, and how you've imported that into your own religious leadership? I'd really be fascinated to hear that. Aaron, do you?
Sure. I'd like to return to what I raised before around racial justice and the responsibilities I feel as a faith leader to keep learning, and not just to keep learning, but learning for the sake of doing. That when Minneapolis was on the front pages and in social media after the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, I think about the work I needed to do and the work that the Jewish community needed to do around race. And just because I may have an experience of marginalization doesn't take me off the hook for my own learning related to race. And by extension, I think about how we as a community at Adath, but again, the Jewish community in general, continues to think about what inclusion looks like. And again, just because I may have studied or been a part of a particular community doesn't make me an expert. Just when I think I've figured something out, I go back again to Torah. This is the season that we have a bajillion Jewish holidays and all of a sudden they end. But the last holiday is Simchat Torah, the celebration of Torah, when we finish reading Torah and we start reading Torah from the beginning, from Genesis again. And it's a great reminder that the Torah is the same each year, but we're different. And so we approach the Torah hopefully with that curiosity and willingness to say, I don't know, or I think I figured it out, but I have more to do. And so for me as a religious leader, I'm always curious. Great, I think I've mastered this, or I think I've learned this, but wait, there's more. And as soon as, that idea of just mastering something and being satisfied, it, in some ways, is a product of white supremacy. And to kind of pause in that moment and say, wait, I have more learning to do. And maybe if each of us approaches relationships or politics or whatever issues are in front of us with that sense of, I have more learning to do, maybe we'd be in a different place, and having good partners to do it with. And again, I think this setting and being with religious leaders from Collegeville and elsewhere, where we can have these conversations, again, not to avoid the difficult questions, but to engage them and have relationships be at the core of everything.
Yeah, that's all very well put. I endorse that message. I would add, from my own experience, I think, one thing I hope that, identifying my own journey, I guess, with identifying as part of the queer community, and, being a pastoral leader, I hope, and this is, I think, related to what Aaron said, but I hope it's taught me. I mean, I think I need to remind myself of this often, but I hope that it's taught me not to make assumptions, related to your question about breaking down the binaries, Marty. I mean, I've certainly experienced throughout my life people making many assumptions about me, as female clergy, as when I coming out as a queer female pastor. I mean, that's like a lot of identities that can be meaningful or provocative to people depending on who they are, and you get a lot projected onto you, and I hope that how that is all sort of processed in me is that, then when I look at somebody else and I feel that rush to kind of make some conclusions about what might be, you just never know kind of what's going on inside people. And, I think what Aaron was pointing to, or what I heard in what he was saying, was just this posture of humility. And, another way toward that is just, the mystery of other people, respecting the mystery that is other people, and letting them tell us who they are, and listening well. And it's very easy to jump to conclusions about people, like when you know where they live, what their job is, what they look like, how they spend their day. It's just really, really easy to then arrive at all kinds of conclusions about what that means, about how they see the world, and how they might, and being, again, just constantly, it's human to do that. I don't think we should shame ourselves for doing that. Like, that's just a human thing. But if we can then move beyond that and be willing to be corrected, and taught by others, again, I think that can sometimes be the breakthrough moment. And I've had lots of moments where I've been surprised by people. And those are some of the most exciting moments in ministry.
Oh, so beautifully said. Yeah.
How do you model that for other people? I mean, how do you, as religious leaders, how do you model that kind of challenge to the assumptions for others in your congregation? How do you use your power? And this is a question from the chat room. How do you use the power you have as religious leaders to kind of model the justice you seek?
It's much easier to be in relationship with people with whom there's agreement. And I think about the reproductive justice work that Abby and I have been involved with, and inevitably in that space, other issues come up. And I know for me, having conversations with people in that community about Israel, and sharing my identity as a Zionist and how important that is to me. Those are really hard conversations sometimes, because the people with whom I'm building relationships on a number of issues, there isn't necessary agreement on everything. And how do we kind of assume goodness? And to go back to what Abby was talking about, there's so many assumptions that are made, but goodness is not always assumed, or goodwill is not always assumed. And if we start from that point, it doesn't mean that we have it all figured out, but at least there's a container for the relationship. And I think a lot about, especially these last 19 months with the pandemic, of a teaching from one of my mentors about the need to build the ark before the flood comes. And this Shabbat in the Jewish community, we're reading about Noah and the flood that consumes the earth. And so often we wait until there's a crisis to build the ark. We wait for a flood, or we wait whatever crisis has emerged, and then we hope to somehow solve it in the moment. But I think using our power to invest in relationships early on with people who have vastly different understandings of the world, and who on profound human issues or issues that affect identity, that we're willing to say, let's be in conversation. It doesn't mean I'm in it to change your mind, but I'm in it because you're a person and I'm a person. And if I'm going to start from a place of your dignity and my dignity, I have to know you first. And the temptation to start from the issue, which is often how social media presents it, takes us off the hook from actually engaging the person. So if I start with the issue, I don't necessarily know the person behind it, and it just stays as an issue. But if I really know the person, it then forces me to take on the responsibility to use my power and time to build a relationship, and I think address issues more effectively. But that's not, I think, how we're trained to operate. We kind of have to undo the temptation to start with the issue and attack the person versus know the person and engage the issue.
Yeah, that's so right. Like, we start with debate, and like who I mean, some people enjoy that, I think. You know, and but a lot of people don't. And yeah, and I think it kind of calls it, like, what is the point, you know, really at the end of the day? Like, what is our goal? And I think in a lot of social justice work, I don't know, I find myself wondering if we've lost, like, some, like, is it to get everybody on our side, or is it to build the relationships and the coalitions that will be necessary to kind of arrive at some sort of new world that we can't even quite envision yet? You know, which is a really different, much more uncomfortable thing. Because I know that I have a vision of how I would like the world to look. But if I'm coming from a posture of humility, I have to remember that I mean, I know this is surprising, but I'm not right about everything, you know. And so, yeah, I think that kind of idea of relationship first is really counterintuitive, because it forces us to maybe deprioritize some of our deepest values, which is really confusing. And maybe that's not quite the right way to say it. I mean, I think I'm sort of searching for something here that I haven't quite arrived at yet, like that you've made me think about, Aaron. But because I really struggle too with, you know, I've worked in a lot of different arenas where whatever the issue was deeply personal, like whether it was reproductive justice or LGBTQIA advocacy, or you know, healthcare. I mean, stuff where it's like it feels like it's my life and the life of people I love on the line. And so it's very hard to kind of be like, you know, to not just lose my mind, basically, and feel like I can't, you know, this is the most important thing in the world, and anybody who can't see it, like, what is wrong with them, you know? And I think for me that therein comes the, like, we don't have to do it all at once, and we don't have to, like, not everybody has to do all the things, which has been a really important learning for me the older I get. That there are like seasons for different kinds of activism and involvement. And like they're all valid. I mean, there's like really valid and good, but that it's okay to take breaks. It's okay to step back. It's okay to say, I mean, I once went and spoke at a college representing the Minnesota Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And and I was invited by the college's pro-choice organization. They wanted to hear, a Christian pastor talk about a Christian sort of framework for reproductive choice. And all of these anti-choice students showed up, like unexpectedly, like vastly outnumbering the group of the group that had originally invited me. And I was like, you know what? I'm not up for this. Like, I don't think I could like have a debate with, I mean, it was like 30 19-year-olds like staring at me, I just like, it was like, I set boundaries in that moment. And I was like, I'm gonna like give my prepared remarks, and I'm actually not gonna take anti-choice like that, because that's not what I was invited to do. So I think that sort of sense of we can actually make choices in all of this, and not just react all the time, which has again been sort of revelatory for me. Like the older I get and the more I learn as a leader.
I'm so grateful this is being recorded, because I want to go back, Abby, and listen to how you just responded. It was really powerful. You were talking about this point of confusion, and where I almost think as religious leaders and religious communities, that's where we all come in when we're bombarded or where we feel overwhelmed. And in the Jewish tradition, we have this great tradition of Musar, of studying ethical character traits. And Musar is all about right sizing, of taking whatever has been presented to us and saying, wait a second, you're teaching this in some way. I have a choice, right? I have this bechira point. I have this moment when I can choose one way or the other. And so often, maybe we feel the need to keep returning to do it the way we've always been doing it. And we're not conscious that we actually have a choice. So in that moment on the college campus, for you to make that choice, here's what's right in this moment. Here's what I can take on. And that as spiritual leaders, how are we modeling different ways of doing things? Again, going back to, what have models often look like of power, right? Again, I think back to white supremacy, in which it has to look one way. And if we want to break that down, we actually have to take seriously what it means to model healthy boundaries and what it means to model healthy relationships. And when we're not doing that, we're reinforcing all of the systems we claim to be going out there to deconstruct, but we're actually rebuilding them. And I think it actually makes the work harder, and it makes the relationships harder to actually cement.
That's such a great point, Aaron. I think, that like social justice work isn't about productivity, but in a capitalist culture, it's really hard to remember that. Yeah. And part of resisting white supremacy is figuring out how not to make our social justice work a product. Yeah. Because then it's also a performance, and it's and we hope to get an A+ on it, which is
right. And when we don't, there's a sense of burnout, or there's a sense of lack of continuity. So, when marriage equality made its way into reality in Massachusetts, and then there was an effort to organize around trans health, there wasn't the same momentum. And so it holds, I think when we look at the whole system, it holds us accountable for the day-to-day experience and lives rather than the issues, because issues come and go, but hopefully, humanity is sticking around, and if we're going to stick around for the long haul, we have to figure out how to engage one another beyond this issue or that issue. And I say that aware of the enormous amount of time it takes to build relationships versus advocating for an issue. But there again, the way we are programmed, I don't want to say hardwired, but the way that we're programmed, the way the news is presented, the way social media unravels or unfolds, is to give us an issue. We all fight on that issue, and then we win or we lose, right? It's the binary, right. Win or we lose, and then, okay, on to the next issue, on to the next flood, on to the next emergency. But have we actually built the ark? Have we actually spent the time to fortify those relationships that, at the end of the day, matter the most? And I say that aware that some of these quote unquote issues are like whether or not somebody has access to healthcare, or whether or not Black and brown people can walk safely in the streets of Minneapolis. So I'm not minimizing the importance of issues, but I do think they have to be accompanied by, are we taking the time to build relationships?
Right, because without the relationships, I mean, I think what I'm really noticing in sort of the worlds that I follow, without the relationships, ultimately, no one actually knows what they're talking about or what is needed.
Yeah, we're talking past each other, and we're taking ourselves off the hook. And again, not to give Minnesota too hard of a time, but again, to not mistake hard conversations as fights. We can have hard conversations, and if we're having enough of them, over time we build that container and say, oh, this was a really hard conversation, but it was for the sake of building something larger, not just for this moment, but what are we invested in long term? And if we're willing to put the hard truths on the table, then there's the potential that this actually gets into the culture of how we live. And I thought a lot about that in seminary around, policy changes versus cultural changes, and how does it seep into the system? So that's how we operate, and that becomes the norm.
Right, and that really challenging interplay between policy and cultural change. And when one out, like, policy sometimes happens ahead of culture change, and then there's backlash. And I mean, it's a really complex. I think about this time, and when there's, a lot of like efforts to make policy. I think in Minneapolis even right now, and it's like, where is the culture? I just think it'll be 20 years from now, what will they make of this time?
Oh, so true. 2 years from now, like any period of time looking out. I wonder.
Yeah.
Can you give an example? I'm just so fascinated by this difference that between a policy that hasn't caught up with the cultural change. I would really be served by an example of that. Does anything come to mind?
Well, I sort of immediately think of, I think there are a lot of examples. It's, often around civil rights legislation from, the hallmark civil rights legislation of the 60s through to, race-related civil rights efforts of the 60s through to like gay marriage, and where there's just, again, it's like things can be just kind of out of sync. And in our very complicated nation, where there's federal laws, there's state laws, there's local laws, and we're and we're vast, as we all know. And a law might be put into place that changes the landscape instantly, changes reality instantly, but the landscape is still kind of shifting in its own way. And I think it's really hard, and I don't know what any of it really means. It's more just kind of, I think, acknowledging the complexity, and that, like a policy or a law doesn't instantly make things better. I think is sort of an important truth to acknowledge, even though they're very important. I don't know. It's such yeah, I think holding things in the gray complexity is so frustrating because it makes everything much harder. But at the same time, I think it's so necessary for people, again, if we want to kind of build these more authentic relationships, I mean, it's helpful to start having to hold the complex worldview.
Right. And I think about Loving v. Virginia, that was decided by the Supreme Court in 1967 at a time when certainly public opinion was not in favor of interracial marriage. That was ahead of it in some ways. It was moving things along legally at a time when public opinion was not there yet. And so how can each of us, aware of our power, and so therefore each of us will do this differently, but how can we position ourselves to be in relationship with, when we're, let's say, if most of us are living in rural areas or most of us are living in urban areas, how do we mix things up more and make things more interesting so that we're encountering difference? Or in organizations, kind of to give the example I gave before briefly, doing reproductive, health work to, in that space, recognize that on many issues, there may be differences. And to not ignore those differences, but to say, wait a second, we may be coming together for this particular purpose, but how do we look at other issues, or how do we think about other issues? And that may inform what we're doing, that may enrich what we're doing here, and that may also enrich what we're doing down the line. And so I'm always interested, I gave the example in that space as part of the national strategic planning, having conversations that are really precious to me around Israel, and to help people who may not be as familiar to know that American Jews have a wide range of views about Israel, much like Americans have a wide range of views about America. And if somebody were to look at our country 4 years ago, or look at our country a year ago, or look at our country today, depending on who's in government, does not dictate that every American supports that. And so when we make issues more complex, what that means is we're actually seeing real people behind those issues. And we're willing to say, I'm with you in it beyond this single moment, or beyond this single administration, or beyond this single policy. And if we're invested in cultural change, I'm going to keep coming back to the relationship to see what's possible. And by the way, I think to Abby's really wise point, to also know when to step back and to say, this relationship is destructive, or this relationship is harmful.
Or this isn't the moment.
Or this isn't the moment. Exactly. This isn't the moment. And I need to step back. And I think, again, it goes back to boundaries of saying, here's what I can do. And here's what I think I heard you say you could do, right? To really check in with the other person to make sure, are we on the same page? Not necessarily because we agree, but are we on the same page in moving forward to engage with one another? And to also know when it's not healthy. And I think sometimes where we see this corrosive political discourse is not knowing when it's time to step back, and not knowing when it's time to say, you know what, this is not the right time for this conversation. I think there may be a better time, or this may just not be the right person with whom to have the conversation. And I'm convinced, right, I'm of the belief that people who share different political beliefs than I do don't walk around and say, oh, I'm just waiting to see the light. I just haven't figured it out yet, and I need Aaron to show. Like, that's not how people operate in the world. People generally believe that they're inclusive and inviting and warm, and how do we kind of recognize how people see themselves and choose to work with that, or choose to step back and say, not for me, or not at this moment.
Let me then interject. I mean, where this conversation has gone in the last couple of minutes is it's titled Spiritual Leadership in Times of Crisis and Chaos. And what you both seem to be saying in this emphasis on relationships is that, no, it's really that leadership really has already had to be done in times of relative calm to build a kind of foundation for dealing with times of crisis. To deal with the flood, you've got to build the ark first. So how do you build relationship, say within your congregations, or Abby, within this Damascus group that you have? How do you build the relationships to have within your own congregation, Aaron, conversations about Israel, on which I'm sure a number in your community disagree about? So why don't you go first, Aaron?
What I found helpful is to see it as a long-term effort, and that if we get caught in just this moment, in whatever is coming up right now, that's not going to be helpful in the longer term effort. So to say, okay, how do I situate a conversation? Maybe not when there's a conflict unfolding, let's say in the Middle East, but when it's a little bit quieter, not that it's ever really quiet, but when it's a little bit quieter, maybe that's the time to sow the seeds. If we think about that in our own, Minnesota landscape, I'm not going to plant something in the middle of January and expect it to grow in that moment, but I am going to be thinking of, right, what can I be doing to plant the seeds at the right time? How am I sensitive to the soil? Am I going to do it when things are just like hot and angry, or am I going to do it right? So just being sensitive to all of those pieces and all of that timing, and seeing it as a long-term vision. So if we can have conversations about the political landscape in Israel, that's going to be more helpful than shouting about a particular moment. And by extension, I think the same in this country. If we're going to talk about the issues that matter, how do we find the right time? When are we going to do it? How are we going to go about it? And that to me is, I guess, how we build relationships.
Abby, you want to respond to Aaron on that?
Or maybe build. Yeah, I would almost maybe challenge the idea that there's ever a quiet time. I think that also might be some work, some thinking I've been doing lately is that's also sort of a seduction of white supremacy a little bit, to even think that there has ever been a new, like, sort of, I think, I'm also a trained social worker, and I think that one thing that's given me is that, like, the trauma informed lens. And I think, one thing to remember is that if you're trying to sort of like build relationships, particularly across difference, is that somebody, there's so much pain, and people are just in pain, and everybody's pain, the pain that communities are feeling and that individuals are feeling is so different. I mean, it's very diverse, that pain, but much of it is due to trauma, individual trauma, generational trauma, cultural trauma. I mean, there's just these ripples of trauma. And I think we can't avoid it. So, like, how do we meet it with integrity and care, and still like deal with it? And so I think, we can still have hard conversations. But part of the way of being trauma informed is to, like, how do you set it up so that everyone can feel as safe as possible? Everyone has escape routes. Everybody has everybody knows the expectations. Everybody knows the boundaries. Everybody knows their roles. You know, I think in Andrew, I know your name. Aaron spoke earlier about containers. And I think it's like the container. What is the, you know, in any relationship building, in any endeavor, in any faith community, in any project, it's like building a container that can hold the relationships in all their messiness. And, you know, acknowledging that not everything will go great and that there might be conflict that we don't anticipate. And then like having a process for handling that and recovering from that. Because half of good boundaries is not just never crossing them, it's recovering from crossing them. And learning from them and being able to like bounce back and not losing the relationship. So I think it's kind of a both and, like paying attention to timing and paying attention to the process, like creating good processes. And I think that's where leadership is called right now, is that the world is on fire, but it has been for a long time. And like, so how can leaders sort of curate spaces where people can like give the energy that's needed to like do the hard work that, you know, Aaron was just describing.
I think what you just said is spot on and has made me rethink kind of in this moment. You know, I wonder if it's the role of religious leaders to be curious or to notice how the fire is burning for each person, because I think you're so right to pick up on the fact that it's not that all of a sudden race or misogyny or, you know, this anti-immigrant fervor became a thing. Those have always been a part of American landscape. But to notice where the fire feels particularly hot for one person in one moment and may be different, because I would hate for somebody to think, well, racism started with the murder of George Floyd. Of course it didn't. And so what does it mean to be aware, and what's our responsibility maybe as religious leaders, as faith leaders, to always know that it's never quiet. And if we're saying it's quiet, then we really have enjoyed some luxury in that quietness that doesn't really exist.
Quiet for whom?
Yeah, that's a right. That's a good
And I love that. I love that image, Aaron. How is the fire burning for each person in the room? That really is, that's a beautiful way to express what Abby was saying. I think we have to close this down, although I have the feeling this conversation could go on and on and on.
We like each other.
Yeah.
It's clear you have a lot.
We'll hang here until winter comes, which seems to be a long ways off this year. So
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite Carla Durand from the Collegeville Institute back into the conversation. Carla, thank you.
And thank you, Marty. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Aaron, for this wonderful conversation, this edifying, enriching conversation. And thanks to all of you who have joined us online today. We invite you to join us for future Collegeville Connection events. And please watch for event information and registration details on our website and our social media platforms. Next month, Wednesday, November 3rd, the same time, 12 noon to 1 o'clock Central Time, you'll have the opportunity to hear from the father-daughter duo, Dr. Don Salyers, the founder of the Yale Music School, and Emily Salyers, a musician and one half of the folk duo of the Indigo Girls, who will be joining us for a conversation about faith and music and their intersections, composing songs of justice, and their time spent in residence many years ago as a family here at the Collegeville Institute. So thank you again to Marty and Abby and Aaron, and thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.